Welcome back to another one of your Flip lectures. In today's lecture, we're going to discuss the 1970s. But to begin the 1970s, I want to go back to the election of 1968, where Richard Nixon ran as the Republican candidate. Richard Nixon knew that in order to win the election, he had to get new supporters. And so his campaign focused on looking at the South. It was called the Southern Strategy. And he thought that he could turn these traditionally Democratic states to vote Republican. And the reason he thought that he could do this is because he appealed to the values of middle Americans, many of whom were in the South. His platform included peace with honor in Vietnam, the idea of trying to get out of the Vietnam War, but not doing it in a way that made the United States look weak. He also ran as a law and order candidate, basically dealing with the reaction to all of the violent anti-war protesters and civil rights movements. He also advocated for smaller government and fewer government programs, and he was seen to represent the traditional values that were held by many middle Americans. Nixon's strategy was successful, and he was elected in 1968 over the Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey and an independent candidate, George Wallace, who ran on a platform of segregation. After he was elected, Richard Nixon immediately went to work to fulfill his promise to be a law and order president. He was going to target the anti-war movement and the radical civil rights movement in order to try to restore order to the nation and deal with the fears that many Americans had that the country was growing out of control. In fact, the photo of Nixon shaking hands with Elvis actually came from when Elvis came to Richard Nixon and asked if he could be deputized as an officer in order to help Richard Nixon combat the hippies and the anti-war movement, both of whom Elvis Presley was opposed to. Richard Nixon also would support the rights of police over suspects, trying to give more power to law enforcement and limiting the civil rights of accused suspects. Nixon also went to work in order to adjust the balance of power between the federal government and the states. He was going to come up with an idea called the New Federalism, in which more control is going to be given to state and local governments to determine how they would solve their problems. As part of this, he introduced the concept of revenue sharing, where federal tax money would be given to the states so that they could implement whatever programs that they wanted to implement. However, this would lead to actually more control for the federal government because the government could set conditions for the states getting the money. For example, the fact that the drinking age in the United States is 21 is actually only a consequence of the fact that the federal government said in order to get money for certain things, the states had to have laws that said that. So in reality, Nixon, in trying to reduce the power of the federal government, actually expanded it by introducing federal money to states. But Nixon's great triumphs came with his foreign policy, and he is going to be the person who is going to pioneer the idea of détente, which is going to be a period of time where tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and China are going to be relaxed to the lowest point that they were during the entire Cold War. And the reason that Nixon was able to do this is because Nixon was an anti-communist. If you remember McCarthyism, he was one of the people leading the charge trying to expose communists in the United States. But Nixon was also a smart man, and he believed that the future was going to be multipolar, meaning there was going to be a lot of powerful countries, not just the United States and the USSR. And so as a result of the future, the United States would need good relationships with its rivals in order to ensure a future full of peace and prosperity for the United States. And détente is going to kick off with an unexpected source. In April of 1971, the United States ping pong team was playing in a tournament in Japan. Communist China extended an invite to the U.S. ping pong team to come and play ping pong in China and to visit. This is going to be the first time that Americans would visit China since the communist takeover in 1949. It was an unexpected gesture, and it was a signal that China wanted to have better relations with the United States. So after this invitation to the American ping pong team, Richard Nixon reached out to China, and the relationship with China they would form would become known as ping pong diplomacy. So after the ping pong team visited, Richard Nixon decided to set up a visit to China. And a lot of people wonder, why was Nixon the president who went to visit China? And the reason why Nixon could do this over somebody like Lyndon Baines Johnson was that Nixon was the most anti-communist person who had been president in a very long time. And only the most anti-communist person could go negotiate with the communists without appearing weak. But this visit to China is going to really strengthen the relationship between the United States and China, leading to fewer trade restrictions and increased prosperity for the United States. Also, the fact that the United States was building up a good relationship with China put pressure on the Soviet Union to also meet and negotiate with the United States. Here's a photo of Richard Nixon touring China. It's a picture of Richard Nixon eating traditional Chinese food with many members of the Communist Party. And here's one of my favorite pictures, because after Nixon's visit to China, American entrepreneurs put the face of Richard Nixon and the Chinese leader Mao Zedong onto ping pong paddles that they then sold to the American public, as kind of a massive joke dealing with the fact that the relations with China would become known as ping pong diplomacy. So the visit with China is going to open up the United States-Soviet relations. And in May of 1972, the United States and the Soviet Union are going to agree to have a summit. What a summit is basically a meeting of all of the top leaders of nations. And so Richard Nixon went to the capital of the Soviet Union, Moscow, in Russia, to meet with the Soviet premier, Leonid Brezhnev. The premier is the Soviet equivalent of the president. And during this meeting, the United States and Soviet Union negotiated things that they had never talked about at any other point in the Cold War. They're going to sign a treaty called the SALT I Treaty, the Strategic Armaments Limitations Treaty, in order to limit the amount of nuclear weapons that each country would have. This was a huge step towards relaxing tensions and relaxing the threat of nuclear war. There was also an agreement to increase trade between the two countries and to exchange some scientific information so that both countries could benefit. After this summit, the tensions between the capitalists and communists, the United States and the Soviet Union, are going to be the lowest they will be for the entirety of the Cold War. So ultimately, it can be said that Nixon's foreign policy is incredibly successful, as he deals with both communist China and the communist Soviet Union, and both relaxes tensions and opens up trade between the countries. Here's a picture of the Moscow summit. On the left is Leonid Brezhnev, and on the right, American President Richard Nixon. And here is a photo from the historic signing of the SALT I Treaty that would limit the amount of nuclear weapons that each country would possess and build. But Richard Nixon's foreign policy accomplishments would be overshadowed by a scandal that he would be at the center of inside the United States. This scandal will be known as the Watergate scandal, and it would lead to catastrophic consequences for the United States political life. So the event known as Watergate happened during 1972 when Richard Nixon was running to be president again, his re-election campaign. And during this time, Richard Nixon was fairly paranoid about what people were saying about him and about his chances in order to win the presidency. So as a result, 5 Nixon supporters hired by his campaign to be reelected broke into the Watergate Hotel where the Democratic Party headquarters was stationed. Their goal was to steal information about the election and also to put taps on all the phones so that Nixon's reelection campaign would have inside information and gain an advantage. However, these burglars were caught and arrested, and eventually they would be linked directly to the Nixon campaign for re-election. Immediately after this happens, the Nixon White House is going to deny any involvement. They're going to say that Richard Nixon had nothing to do with it and nobody in the White House knew about this break-in by Nixon supporters. And so the story is going to die down for a while, as most people are going to believe the president. However, 2 reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, are going to keep investigating this scandal, and with the help of a confidential informant whom they call Deep Throat, they would uncover this scandal and they would publish it. As a result of these 2 reporters breaking this scandal, a government investigation would begin. So during their investigation of the Nixon White House and how much Richard Nixon knew about the break-in, it was revealed that Richard Nixon had recorded all of the White House conversations that happened, and he had tapes detailing all of these conversations. Investigators wanted these tapes so that they could prove what Nixon knew or didn't know about the Watergate break-in. However, Richard Nixon did not want to turn these tapes over, and he cited the executive privilege, which says that basically any White House conversation is confidential in the interest of national security. And so Nixon refused to hand over the tapes, and the case went all the way. So the case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court eventually ruled that these conversations about potentially the Watergate break-in were not in fact protected under executive privilege, and so Nixon had to hand over all the unedited tapes to the investigators. After these tapes come out, in April of 1974, Nixon will be impeached, which means that he will be formally charged with presidential misconduct, and a trial would then begin to see whether or not he should be removed as the president. After the tapes were out and after all the evidence had been gathered, Richard Nixon on August 9th of 1974 chooses to resign the presidency rather than be convicted of wrongdoing and removed from office. This was a huge moment in American history, as the president, who had vehemently denied any involvement in Watergate, then resigned, basically admitting his guilt. So Richard Nixon is going to leave office in a very iconic photo of Richard Nixon's last act as president, flashing the V for victory while getting on the presidential helicopter for the last time. Right after Richard Nixon left office, his vice president, Gerald Ford, was sworn in as the President of the United States. But ultimately, Watergate had a huge and lasting impact on the United States. Some people think that Watergate was good because it proved that no person, even the President of the United States, is above the laws of the country. That Richard Nixon broke the law and therefore had to suffer the consequences. But ultimately, this led to a loss of respect and faith in the office of the presidency and the government. The distrust that had developed during Vietnam would get even deeper, and Americans would start to become very cynical about their government and lose respect for the office of presidency. And Watergate's also going to lead to new laws, both in campaign reform to try to prevent the type of situation where people would try to break into opponents' headquarters, and new procedures for how to investigate high-level government officials after the investigation of Richard Nixon proved problematic. So Watergate is going to leave a lasting impact on United States politics and society, and to this day, any large scandal will usually have the word "gate" attached to the end of it, as if to invoke the largeness of the Watergate scandal. But during the 1970s, the economy was in crisis, and a couple of things happened that led the United States economy to basically have trouble. The first was a concept that became known as stagflation. And what stagflation is it's a combination of two economic problems. The first problem is inflation. Inflation happens when there is too much money in circulation, and so money is worth less. And when money is worth less, prices will go up. However, inflation does not always mean that wages and salaries go up. So this means that your dollar simply will not buy as much as it bought previously. Combined with a stagnant economy, or an economy in recession, where basically the country is not growing, there are not new jobs, and in fact the economy is shrinking, it's losing jobs. Combined with inflation, this creates a serious price crisis. But the reason for the stagnant economy was that the world started to recover after World War II, and so global competition is going to start to slow the dominance of United States industry that the United States had enjoyed throughout the 1950s and most of the 1960s. But ultimately, the thing about stagflation is that no one is really sure how to fix this crisis, because normally these two separate things never happen at the same time. Inflation will usually happen when the economy is growing and there is high demand and spending. Basically, the idea is that if people spend a lot of money, there should be more money. And if people are borrowing a lot of money to start new businesses, there should be more money. And if people are losing jobs, if businesses are shrinking, then there should be less money. However, stagflation was a very real problem that happened in the 1970s. combined with stagflation was an embargo of the United States of petroleum. Many of the Middle Eastern oil-producing countries organized themselves into the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and these are going to be Arab states that are going to be in the Middle East. But in 1973, OPEC is going to refuse to ship petroleum to the United States. This is known as an embargo. And they're going to do this because of the United States' support for the State of Israel throughout the 1970s. This is going to lead to fuel shortages and really high gas prices in the United States. Because there's going to be low supply and the demand is still going to be high, you're going to have both shortages and people are going to raise the prices of gasoline. So these two economic crises combined are going to create a very difficult situation for the economy in the 1970s. Here's a picture of some gas stations from this time. And they would even limit the amount of gas that you could buy, and you could only buy gas on even certain days. People would wait in line, sometimes for hours, in order to get fuel because it was rare that gas stations would have fuel every single day. So Gerald Ford had a very brief presidency. He's going to become president after Richard Nixon resigns, and he is actually going to be a president that most people are going to be pretty excited about. He's an ordinary kind of average man and not very controversial. But his first act is that he's going to pardon Richard Nixon, meaning that he's going to absolve him of all wrongdoing. This means that Richard Nixon could never be put on trial for the things that he did with the Watergate scandal. Gerald Ford's logic was that the country was already divided and the country didn't need the shame and the distraction of having a massive trial for one of its former presidents. But Gerald Ford also met some difficulties, and he failed to deal with stagflation, and he never figured out how to get around the OPEC embargo. So the economy under Gerald Ford was very poor, though perhaps through no fault of his own, though his policies did not fix the problem. He's also going to try to continue détente. He's going to try to negotiate with the Soviet Union. But during this time, once Nixon was gone, the Soviet Union is going to start to not live up to some of its agreements, and so the American public is going to turn away from the idea of détente and go back to the belief the Soviet Union could not be trusted to negotiate and live up to their end of agreements. So in 1976, the Americans are going to have a chance to elect a new president. President Gerald Ford is going to run for the Republicans, and Jimmy Carter, a peanut farmer from the South, is going to run as an outsider. He's going to run as a Democrat, but he's going to say that he's an outsider, that he's not a part of Washington. And so he promises change, he promises new things, and ultimately he promises to restore morality and honesty to the presidency. An important promise after so many in the United States were still reeling from the revelations of Watergate and the belief that the office of the president had lost a lot of its respect and gravity. So in 1976, Jimmy Carter is going to win a very narrow win against the incumbent Gerald Ford, and he is going to become the new president of the United States. Jimmy Carter, in trying to live up to his outsider image and his idea of being a man of the people, is actually not going to ride in his limo all the way to his inauguration, but he's actually going to get out and walk. This has been something that other presidents have emulated, including Barack Obama. But Carter's presidency is going to be characterized by many failures. His economic plans that he came into office touting are all going to fail to stop inflation and are not going to get the economy out of recession and into recovery. On top of that, the energy crisis over the OPEC embargo is going to deepen even further. Carter attempted to regulate prices of oil and of gasoline in order to lessen the burden on Americans, but they're actually going to worsen the crisis. His policies are largely going to be failures. And then when Carter tried to change his policies and go in a different direction, those policies too failed to solve the economic problems of the 1970s. As a result of his inability to deal with these problems and his willingness to change his mind about what he was going to do, the American public came to believe that he was a poor leader. They believed that he had trouble getting anything done and that ultimately he was not a strong enough leader to lead the country through this crisis. On top of some difficulties for Jimmy Carter inside the United States, he also had a lot of difficulty in his foreign policy. It was under Carter's presidency that the U.S.-Soviet relations that had improved during détente détente ultimately broke down. President Carter very publicly criticized the many human rights violations of the Soviet Union. And as a result of this public criticism, the Soviet Union is going to be a lot less willing to negotiate with Carter than they were with Richard Nixon. And in 1973, the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. And under Jimmy Carter's direction, the United States actually boycotted the Olympics, and they put an embargo, meaning that they were not going to ship any grain or food to the Soviet Union. So these actions ultimately signaled that détente, that easing of tensions, was over, and the United States and Soviet Union were once again very opposed to one another in the world. However, Carter also had some things go on during the Middle East during his presidency. One success that he had was known as the Camp David Accords, where Carter successfully negotiated a peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, who were traditionally very, very bitter enemies. But in 1978, the Camp David Accords were signed, and peace between these two countries seemed a possibility. However, Carter also had to deal with a crisis in the Middle East during his presidency. During 1979, there was a revolution in Iran. The United States had supported a leader known as the Shah, who was in charge of Iran. However, there was a revolution that put in his place the Ayatollah Khomeini, and it was basically an Islamist revolution. There was anger about the United States taking in the overthrown leader and protecting him from what the Iranians believed was justice. They wanted to put him on trial for crimes that he had committed while he was leader. So as a result of this, Iranian revolutionaries will take over the United States Embassy and take 52 Americans hostage. And they will hold these hostages for over a year, 444 days. Jimmy Carter failed to negotiate their release, and his rescue attempt is going to fail. And in fact, this military exercise is going to be a disaster because one of the helicopters is going to crash over the desert near Iran, and 8 soldiers are actually going to die. Carter's inability to deal with the Iran hostage crisis creates another example of how Americans saw him as a poor leader. Here's a photo of the Camp David Accords, where Jimmy Carter successfully negotiated a treaty between Israel and the country of Egypt. Here's a photo of the Iran hostage crisis, and this is the United States Embassy that's being stormed by Iranian revolutionaries. This is a picture of the Ayatollah Khomeini, who is going to basically be the leader of these revolutionaries, and who is going to basically be the one who Carter is going to fail to negotiate the release of the hostages with. Here's another Time magazine cover, and basically these hostages were in the news every single day. And this led to even more people believing that Jimmy Carter was an ineffectual leader. One more photo of the hostages being held in Iran, and ultimately they would be released. But they will not be released until Ronald Reagan is sworn in as president. So, in kind of their final affront to Jimmy Carter, the Iranians refuse to release the hostages until a new president, Ronald Reagan, will be elected in 1980. This also proved to a lot of Americans that Jimmy Carter had been a weak leader, and that Ronald Reagan would be a stronger one whom they could trust to deal with people in the world. So now I want to talk a little bit about 70s culture. And the 1970s are going to become known as the Me Decade. This term is going to be coined by author Tom Wolfe. It's going to be called the Me Decade because of the obsession of the search for self-fulfillment during this time. So why were people so focused on themselves, looking for self-fulfillment and their idea of happiness? Well, this is because of a couple of things. The first is the failure of the counterculture and a lot of other movements in the 1960s, which left people feeling confused and lost. That basically they had believed things would turn out one way, and then they didn't, and so then they were basically looking for something else to basically believe in, or something to explain why it had failed. There was also a ton of scandals. There was an economic crisis. The Vietnam War was still going on, and so people wanted to focus on themselves rather than these big national problems. What's going to come out of this is going to be a culture of self-obsession. The New Age movement is going to come along and basically tell people that everything that you need is within yourself. These are going to be things like using crystals and kind of trying out different interpretations of religions, and this movement is going to spread throughout the country. It's also going to be a time of self-help. Self-help seminars are going to become a very, very big thing. Self-help books. For example, one type of self-help seminar is going to involve people basically trying to get in touch with maybe their inner child, in something called primal scream therapy, which the Beatle John Lennon did, where basically you try to return yourself to the primal state of your being so that you can understand something more about yourself, and basically that will help you. This is also a time where therapy becomes a very, very big deal in the United States. A lot of people start seeking out therapists in order to basically try to improve themselves and to work out their individual problems. And so, basically, the 1970s, the culture becomes very self-obsessed as opposed to looking at, collectively, the society the way it was more in the 1960s. But the 60s are also going to have a big impact on changes in things like television. The Mary Tyler Moore Show is going to be the first television show that features a single career-oriented woman as a main character. The women's liberation movement of the 1960s opened up the door for a show like the Mary Tyler Moore Show to be on national television. And so it sent out the message that it was okay for women to have careers and be single. The show All in the Family basically featured a regular old family, but this show dealt with a lot of the big social issues of the time. The dad on the show, Archie Bunker, represented kind of the old type of American. And the show dealt with issues of poverty, race, and other things that basically allowed for the American public to explore its own feelings about all these social changes while laughing along with this fictional family. Minorities are also going to break onto television during this time. A very popular show, a spin-off of All in the Family, will be The Jeffersons, about a wealthy African-American family living in the city. These people were not portrayed this way until the 1970s, but The Jeffersons is going to become an extraordinarily popular TV show, and it's going to deal with a lot of issues, also including race, but also the bigotry that George Jefferson, the main character, held against other people in society. But beyond just a show about affluent African Americans, there's also going to be a show called Good Times, which is going to be a show about a family struggling to make it in Chicago, basically faced with poverty and a lot of the social issues that were facing African Americans during this time. And so these two shows are going to bring minorities into American society in a way that they never had been before. And this is all a result of the social movements of the 1960s. There's also going to be the disco culture that is going to come up during the 1970s. And it's going to reach its peak with the film Saturday Night Fever starring John Travolta. And disco music and the disco craze is going to become a symbol of this 1970s era. Because disco music was not about the music itself. That's why basically it will become very unpopular once the fad is over. But disco music was all about these big glamorous clubs where people would dress up in brand new clothes and basically try to be very stylish, and it was centered not on the music but on the dancer, and people would compete to try to be the center of attention at the disco club. Again, this fad is going to kind of reflect the idea the 70s is a me decade, a self-obsessed, self-centered culture that develops during the 1970s. After kind of the collective social consciousness that is going to dominate the 1960s. A very interesting parallel between the idea of the me decade is that today millennials are also being called the me generation. So this idea that kind of culture can become self-obsessive is nothing new. So as you can see, this Time magazine article looks a lot like this New York article from the 1970s. So something to keep in mind when we think about judging past cultures against our current one. So ultimately, the events of the 1970s are going to set the stage for another major change in the United States during the 80s. Americans, cynical about government and cynical about the president Jimmy Carter, are going to turn to a new president and a new way of thinking about politics, conservatism. The divisions in American society are going to continue to grow beyond the 1960s and 70s and into the 1980s. There's also going to be a new era of economic prosperity. And ultimately, the culture is going to turn from the me decade into a decade of indulgence based upon kind of spending, material goods, and again, obsession with lifestyle. So all these changes in the 1970s are going to set the stage for some major changes that we're going to discuss in the 1980s.